Well, any studies that have been done, Joe, have been done by taking, let's say, the DAPT and the polio and the HIV together in a study group, and then the control group gets another vaccine or another set of vaccines. So if we really want to understand what happens to groups of kids that are given vaccines together, we have to A, use a proper control group, and B, we have to be willing to acknowledge that if children get adverse events, it could be related to the combination of vaccines. We also have to be willing to study the immunology. We have to be able to look at the immune system and see how it's developing and what other inflammatory cells are produced, and whether antibodies to certain materials in the vaccines are long lasting. And we don't have any of those studies. Now, you see a 2-month-old, and there are different ways to look at this. And I'm going to look at it from a slightly different perspective than most of my colleagues look at it. A 2-month-old gets vaccinated against 18 different diseases at once. Diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, that's 3. Hepatitis B, that's 4. Polio, that's 3 viruses, that's 7. Rotavirus, that's 3 viruses, that's 10. Haemophilus influenza B, that's 11. And then the Prevnar, which is the PCV7, which is Streptococcus pneumonia, that's 18. And so they get bacterial and viral vaccines against 18 organisms. No one knows what giving a child vaccinations against 18 organisms does. No one knows whether there's interaction between the bacteria and the viruses in those vaccines, or whether there's interaction between the trace thimerosal, which is still in some of them, or now the large amount of aluminum that is in many of those vaccines in relation to the activity of those bacterial particles or viral particles. And so what we would have to do is do the proper control groups to see what happens when you do just aluminum and then a placebo, aluminum and then formaldehyde and a placebo, aluminum, formaldehyde, and a viral particle, and then a control group. Now, there is a scientist named Boyd Haley who has actually looked into some of the vaccine ingredients and what happens to nerve cells when you inject them in the lab to specific vaccine ingredients. And when you keep adding another vaccine ingredient, what happens to the nerve cells. And he specifically showed that in the presence of thimerosal, there's a lot of damage to nerve cells. When you add aluminum to the thimerosal, you need less thimerosal to create the damage to the nerve cells in the presence of aluminum. And then when you add neomycin, which is an antibiotic in some of the vaccines, it potentiates the potency of nerve cell damage with aluminum and mercury together. And then when you culture the nerve cells in testosterone versus estrogen, and you expose them to some of the vaccine ingredients like thimerosal, you actually see that the nerve cells that are exposed to testosterone are damaged in greater amounts than the nerve cells that are bathed in estrogen. Now, that raises some concern, because we do see that children with neurodevelopmental disorders are 4-to-1 boys to girls. So you have to question whether testosterone actually makes children more vulnerable to exposure to toxins like mercury or aluminum or their combination. And so none of these studies have been done in humans. And people say, well, we can't do those studies. And I say, why not? They say it's unethical. I said, well, if it's unethical to do those studies on vaccine ingredients and combining them together, then it's unethical to give the vaccines in general. And so we're missing a lot of important data that we won't believe, and then we're missing a lot of important data that we won't accumulate because those studies won't be done. Because most of the studies that are done by the manufacturers of the vaccines themselves.
Yes. Obviously, a slight conflict of interest.
Well, one can say that's true.
So since our conference that we both attended and spoke at. Last week, Jim Turner filed a lawsuit against the FDA to halt the use of the swine flu vaccine. And for those who don't know, Jim Turner is an attorney out of Washington, D.C. He's been around quite a while. In fact, he's the attorney who filed the lawsuit against the FDA in 1977, which actually stopped them from giving the swine flu vaccine after it had already administered to 50 million people. They had planned to give it to another 150 million people, a total of 200 million people. But he stopped it. So Gary Null is actually the one who's providing the financing for that suit. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on that or any just give us your comments. That would be good.
Well, I think the comment that I'd like to make is that individual people need to be able to make an informed choice about what is right for them and their family. And when you start taking governmental positions that remove the right of people to practice a type of medicine that they believe in, you're no longer practicing science. And there are a number of people who have tremendous concerns whose voices need to be heard. And there are many people who don't feel that the vaccine is right for them and therefore don't want the government or any other authority to stand over them and forcibly vaccinate them. And so the thing that I'd like to say is that if people want to be vaccinated, that is their choice, and the vaccine should be made available to them. But to start rounding people up and threatening them with termination of their job or removal of their child from school or removal of their child from the home is no longer practicing science. It's practicing something very different. So I support the effort that Jim Turner is making to remove the mandates and allow people to make the choice with the right information and a balanced amount of information. So if they want to get vaccinated, that's within their prerogative. But if they don't want to get vaccinated, they're not putting anybody at risk, and they're making a different healthcare choice. Remember, vaccines are drugs. Vaccines are pharmaceutical agents, and vaccines have a greater amount of concern than what we're allowing ourselves to know about. And I think that people should be able to make an informed choice. To automatically assume that vaccines are safe because they've always been safe, as some of my colleagues have stated, is a false assumption. So I support the efforts to stop the mandates and allow for people